Millions of Catholics around the world are in mourning after the death of Pope Francis from a stroke and heart failure. He was 88.
The world is in mourning following reports of the passing of Pope Francis, a figure who was much more than the leader of the Catholic Church. Known for his humility, progressive views, and quiet strength, he touched millions with his compassionate approach and willingness to confront difficult issues. But in the aftermath of his death, questions have begun to surface. Questions that suggest the narrative may be more complex than it appears. Some observers believe that behind the solemnity of Vatican traditions there may be details the public has yet to learn. One unexpected name that has emerged in the media spotlight is that of Sister Cristina. Why has her name become part of the conversation? Could she hold insights into a side of the Pope's life that few ever saw? And what might these revelations mean for the future of the Catholic Church? Who was Pope Francis? Before the white robes and before the eyes of the world followed his every move, he was just Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and he was nothing like what the Vatican had seen in centuries. He was born on December 17, 1936, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, making him the first pope to come from the Americas. He was also the first Jesuit pope and the first to choose the name Francis, in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, a name that hinted from day one that his reign would be a break from tradition. But most people don't know that his early life wasn't soaked in power or prestige like his later life. He was the son of Italian immigrants. His father was a railway worker, while his mother was a housewife. He grew up speaking both Spanish and Italian and navigating a tight-knit Catholic world while also watching Argentina's political chaos unfold around him. Some reports say he was quiet, observant, and deeply devoted, and it was this devotion that would eventually take him to the heights he attained. At the age of 21, he made a very bold, life-changing decision to enter the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits. This society is famous for discipline, education, and its global missionary presence. Everyone knows the Jesuits aren't about living in luxury. They're about living for purpose, and Pope Francis was all in. However, life had other plans for him too. While he was still in his early 20s, he nearly died from a severe lung infection. In fact, part of one of his lungs had to be removed, and unfortunately, this became a health issue that would shadow him for decades to come. He eventually recovered from that illness, but his health was never quite the same again. But instead of letting that weigh him down, he decided to pay more attention to his spiritual life. He became even more intense and even more determined in his walk with God. By 1998, he became the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and that's when people started noticing something different about this man. He literally refused to live in the lavish Archbishop's mansion, and instead, he stayed in a small apartment, cooked his own meals, and took the bus just like everyone else. But this was more than just his lifestyle. It was his message to the world. In 2001, he became a cardinal, but when the time came to elect a new pope in 2005, he reportedly came in second to Joseph Ratzinger, who would go on to become Pope Benedict XVI. At that point, most thought that was the end of the road for him considering his age, but they were wrong. In 2013, the Vatican was reeling. Pope Benedict had done the unthinkable. He resigned. The Church was in crisis, scandals were everywhere, and trust in the Vatican was at an all-time low. The Vatican needed something different and someone different to take over, and that's when Pope Francis stepped into office. Immediately, he stepped out on that balcony and asked the people to pray for him and his predecessor instead of the usual papal blessing. Jaws literally dropped. He didn't wear the golden robes, he didn't sit on the high throne, and he looked pretty ordinary. But that was not a mere coincidence. It was intentional. Pope Francis quickly earned the title of the People's Pope because he rejected the opulence of the Vatican apartments and chose a modest guest house instead. He washed the feet of prisoners, kissed the sick, and openly spoke about mercy, forgiveness, and humility. He even often carried his own briefcase. But don't let the gentle smile fool you, because behind the warmth and humility, Francis was a bold reformer. He tackled issues that made traditionalists tense. He spoke up about climate change, economic inequality, the refugee crisis, and he even called for the creation of a poor church for the poor. That's not all. Francis also urged priests to focus less on dogma and more on compassion. But still, Not everyone loved him. Some inside the Vatican, especially among the more conservative factions, saw him as a threat. They claimed he challenged power structures that had been untouched for centuries. He opened the door, just a crack, to discussions on divorced Catholics, the queer community, and the role of women in the church. But that crack was more than enough to create serious tension behind the scenes. While those who loved him praised him as a revolutionary leader, others accused him of being too political, too lenient, and too different. But the truth remains that, in many ways, Pope Francis was both the bridge and the battlefield between the old traditional church and the new one trying to emerge, and through all of it, he kept going. However, unfortunately, after a while, his body began to slow. Health issues had always been a silent companion in Francis's journey, especially after the illness he had that affected his lungs. And so, as he entered his 80s, the wear and tear began to show. His public appearances became less frequent, his steps slower, and in 2021, he underwent colon surgery, his most serious medical procedure while in office. The Vatican downplayed it, but then the whispers started. To make matters worse, in 2022, photos of Pope Francis being pushed through St. Peter's Basilica in a wheelchair sent shockwaves through the world. He later revealed he was dealing with a serious knee issue that made walking nearly impossible.
Ginocchio non finisce di guarire e non posso essere in piedi tanto tempo.
But that same year, he openly confessed that he had signed a letter of resignation, just in case his health became too much of a burden. But to many people, something was off. This wasn't normal. Popes don't usually talk about quitting. In early 2023, he was hospitalized again for what the Vatican described as a respiratory infection. He stayed 3 nights and again they called it precautionary. But this time Vatican insiders began to feel the walls closing in. But here's the thing. Despite his declining health, Francis refused to slow down completely. He kept meeting world leaders, giving interviews, and even traveling. But something had changed. His once lively eyes looked more tired. His words, though still powerful, came with more pauses, fewer smiles, and all the while it seems one person was watching closely, and it was none other than Sister Cristina. She wasn't in the spotlight, but it turns out she may have been in the background, quietly and consistently observing. And what she noticed about the Pope is not what you would expect. If what she said about the Pope is true, then there's a possibility that his passing may not have been as peaceful as we were led to believe. The day the world went still. On April 21st, 2025, the world was thrown into mourning. The day started like any other quiet Monday morning inside the Vatican walls. It was Easter Monday, and the cobbled courtyards were peaceful. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica chimed softly in the early light. But by mid-morning, something had shifted. Whispers had begun, and the staff moved faster than usual. Phone calls were being made, and soon it was no longer a whisper. Pope Francis was gone. According to the Vatican, he had passed away at the modest guest house where he had chosen to live instead of the lavish papal apartments. The time of death was listed as around 7:35 a.m. Vatican time. In a formal statement delivered just after 9 a.m., Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Camerlengo of the Holy Roman Church, confirmed the news, saying, "Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis." At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and of His Church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and most marginalized. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the one and triune God. These words were careful, calming and scripted, but the silence that followed was louder than anything they could say. Within minutes, the news exploded across global media. Television screens, smartphones, and radio channels were flooded with the same breaking headline, announcing the Pope's death at 88. And then, the tributes began. World leaders didn't wait. From Washington to Buenos Aires and from Rome to Nairobi, presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs offered their condolences. The United States President issued a statement from the White House simply saying, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis," May God bless him and all who loved him. Vice President J.D. Vance wasn't left out. He actually met with the Pope on Easter Sunday, the day before his passing, making him one of the last people to meet with the Pope before his death. He said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill." French President Emmanuel Macron praised his humility and his love for the people, noting that even when parts of the world were going through war and violence, Pope Francis was always so concerned about the most vulnerable people in society. Back in Argentina, his homeland, crowds gathered at the Metropolitan Cathedral in Buenos Aires. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. For many Argentinians, he wasn't just a religious figure, he was family. The Argentine mayor himself declared 7 days of national mourning for the Pope. Religious figures across the spectrum also stepped forward. The Archbishop of Canterbury described Francis as a dear friend. The chief rabbi of Rome praised his efforts against anti-Semitism. And then there were the people, ordinary people. In St. Peter's Square, by the afternoon of April 21st, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. What began as a regular Easter Monday turned into a sea of mourning. Thousands gathered. Some clutched rosaries, others silently wept. Some just stood there, staring at the windows of his now empty room. There were no bells tolling, no grand announcements from balconies, just an eerie, overwhelming stillness. But while the official story pointed to a calm, expected passing, there have been some suspicions that the Vatican may be hiding something. Pope Francis had been sick. On March 15, 2025, he was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital after struggling with respiratory symptoms that Vatican sources initially described as a case of bronchitis. But as the days passed, that diagnosis took on a more serious tone. Behind closed doors, doctors were treating double pneumonia, a far more dangerous condition than bronchitis, especially for an 88-year-old pontiff who had lived most of his adult life with only one functioning lung. The Vatican, as expected, kept the public tone calm. They thanked the faithful for their prayers and framed the hospitalization as a necessary step for his recovery. But to those who'd watched Pope Francis over the years, the signs were very clear that this was different. For over 38 days, he remained under the close care of medical teams. It was his longest hospital stay since becoming Pope. His aides released occasional updates assuring the public he was stable. Reports even confirmed that he had received the sacrament of anointing of the sick while in the hospital. However, the world soon began to understand that this illness was a turning point. Then, on March 23rd, he was finally discharged. The Vatican released photos of the Pope smiling, seated in a wheelchair, surrounded by hospital staff. He reportedly expressed gratitude to the medical teams who had cared for him and made a low-key return to the Vatican. Still, many observers couldn't shake the feeling that he looked noticeably weaker. He reportedly continued using supplemental oxygen as needed. His public schedule remained light, and yet, in true Pope Francis fashion, he surprised everyone when he made a brief, unscheduled appearance at St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday, just 1 day before his death. He offered blessings, greeted a few visitors, and gave no indication that the end might be so close. But behind the global mourning, there was an undercurrent of curiosity, a quiet suspicion that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than we were being told. And with what Sister Cristina has had to say about the Pope, so many questions concerning the Pope's final moments and his passing will finally be answered. Sister Cristina's revelations about Pope Francis. When a global spiritual leader like Pope Francis dies, the world looks for answers in news conferences, in official statements, and sometimes in the quiet corners of memory. But no one expected her name to resurface, not after all these years, and definitely not like this. Yet in the hours following the Pope's passing, the internet couldn't stop whispering about someone who had once captured the hearts of believers and skeptics alike. And that person is Sister Cristina, the singing nun who once stunned the world. But who is she really? And why do people believe she knew something long before the rest of us did? Cristina Scuccia grew up like any other girl, dreaming of music, performance, and self-expression. But unlike most pop stars, her journey took a detour, and she found herself in a convent, She joined the Ursuline Sisters of the Holy Family, a Catholic religious order devoted to service, simplicity, and spiritual discipline. She gave up fame, fashion, and worldly pleasures, and for a long time that was her world. However, fate had other plans. In 2014, Cristina auditioned for The Voice of Italy and stunned not just the judges but millions around the world. When she belted out Alicia Keys' "No One" in full habit, you could feel the air change. Her performance wasn't just beautiful, it was disarming. It shattered stereotypes, invited questions, and gave birth to a global sensation. By the end of the season, she had won, not just the show but hearts around the world. Later that year, something extraordinary happened. Cristina met Pope Francis in person during a general audience at the Vatican. She handed him her debut album, which was a very symbolic moment between the modern and the traditional, the musical and the mystical. The Pope reportedly smiled warmly, and Cristina later said the moment left her deeply moved. Although she didn't say much more, many people sensed something deeper in that meeting. Some viewers, looking back now, claim she said something off-script, something almost prophetic, in a small interview shortly afterward. You see, Cristina spoke about the Church being on the edge of something great and terrible, and how faith needs to find its voice again, even if it's trembling. At the time, those words were brushed off as poetic reflections from a nun-turned pop star. But in the wake of Pope Francis's passing, those same words are being looked at in a whole new light. Was she just speaking in metaphors? Or was she hinting at something she couldn't say out loud? It gets even more complicated, because in 2022, Cristina dropped another bombshell. She was leaving religious life for good. After over 15 years of service, vows, and sacrifice, she walked away from the convent. She didn't renounce her faith, but she chose to live as a layperson and a singer. In interviews after her exit, Cristina described feeling like she had completed a cycle. She said she still prayed, still loved the Church, but had found a different way to serve God. But she said something about Pope Francis that shocked everyone. Cristina said that the Pope made serious efforts to make the Church more accessible and relatable to ordinary people. She said she admired his ability to convey faith with happiness and joy. And she even confessed that he was the one who inspired her to pursue her singing career, despite being a nun. Her words were, "The Catholic Church is going through a kind of makeover, and I am part of that. This Pope isn't removed or distant. He's right here among us, and that's what I'm aiming to be as well." When she talked about the Church being at a crossroads and how she left so she could stay truthful, people started connecting the dots. But it's not just church insiders or journalists talking about Sister Cristina. Social media accounts with hundreds of thousands of views are speculating that she knew something was coming. Her exit from the Church was a way of stepping back from a system she believed was about to change. Others think she may have witnessed something during her time in Rome. Perhaps a private conversation, a growing concern, or a spiritual moment with the Pope that changed her forever. But one thing's for sure, she left the Church just a few years before the Pope's death, with a tone of emotional exhaustion. Was that a coincidence? Maybe. But was it symbolic? Absolutely. And some say there have been whispers of this same exhaustion within the walls of the Vatican, with some cardinals reportedly divided between the modern way the Pope handled the Church before his passing and the good old traditional style of handling the Church. The question is, now that the Pope is gone, what is the future of the Catholic Church? Implications for the Catholic Church. It's important to understand that the passing of Pope Francis didn't just mark the end of a papacy. It cracked open a future filled with uncertainty, tension, and quiet, calculated movement within the marble corridors of the Vatican. You see, it's not just about who wears the white cassock next. It's about what direction the world's largest religious institution will take. Because if one thing is clear, it's the fact that Francis didn't leave the Church the way he found it. So, the question is, what happens now? Who decides what comes next? And how much of Francis's legacy will shape or divide the Church going forward? But the first step begins with choosing the next Pope, a process that is known to many as a sacred game of strategy. The process of selecting a new Pope is called a conclave, and while it may look like a solemn spiritual retreat from the outside, behind those locked Sistine Chapel doors, it's far more complex than most people realize. Technically, it's simple. The College of Cardinals, made up of around 120 cardinals under the age of 80, gathers in secrecy. Reports have it that there are no phones and no outside communication. They pray, they debate, and then they vote. Over and over until one name gets at least 2/3 of the votes. And when that happens, white smoke billows from the chimney, bells ring, and the world hears the words Habemus Papam, which means we have a pope. But what's not so simple about the process is the politics involved. The thing is, not every cardinal shares the same vision of what the church should be. Under Francis, the church leaned into compassion, social justice, environmental issues, and a tone of mercy toward divorced Catholics, the queer community, and the poor. He didn't rewrite doctrine, but he reshaped the emphasis, and that, in Catholic terms, is revolutionary. But in reality, the cardinals are split. Some believe the church needs to double down on Francis's path and keep pushing for reform, openness, and modern relevance, while some others believe otherwise and have been quietly waiting for a shift back to traditionalism, which involves more Latin Mass, stricter rules, and clearer lines in the sand. The conclave that's about to happen is so important because it could determine the church's identity for the next generation. And everyone inside that chapel knows it. With Francis gone, a subtle but powerful vacuum has opened up. Despite his age and ailments, Francis held the church together through sheer presence. He was seen as a moral compass, even by people who disagreed with him. But now, there's room for maneuvering. And already, factions are forming behind closed doors. There are whispers and rumors of key cardinals positioning themselves, not necessarily for the papacy, but for influence. Think about Cardinal Peter Turkson from Ghana, who is widely known as a longtime voice on climate change, or Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Italy, who is known for his diplomatic work and closeness to Francis's more progressive tone. Then, on the more conservative side, there's Cardinal Raymond Burke, who some say is a staunch traditionalist who has clashed with Francis before, and others who've long wanted a return to rigid clarity and conservative doctrine. No one knows who will rise. But one thing is sure, the discussions won't just be spiritual. They'll be strategic, theological, and of course political. Because the next pope won't just inherit a church, he'll inherit a world that's watching every move. But while it's tempting to think the church's biggest challenge is simply who the next pope will be, that's not the only challenge. The real mountain ahead is about how the church relates to the modern world and whether it can remain relevant, trusted, and unified. Some of the most pressing issues include the challenge of declining membership, especially in the West. In Europe and North America, the Catholic Church is losing members fast. Churches are emptying. Young people are disengaged. Scandals have driven some away, but others simply feel the church doesn't speak to their reality anymore. The next pope will have to reignite faith without alienating traditionalists, which is an extremely hard task to achieve. Then there's the issue of intimate maltreatment crisis and trust issues. The damage caused by decades of inappropriate behavior scandals isn't over. Francis made efforts toward transparency and reform, but many believe those efforts didn't go far enough. Some of the survivors and advocates of these scandals are still calling for justice, institutional change, and accountability at the highest levels. Whoever comes next will need to act, not just talk or risk losing credibility completely. Another challenge is the discussion surrounding women's role in the church. This is a silent tension that's getting louder every year. Women make up the majority of church members worldwide, yet they hold almost no decision-making power. Under Francis, conversations about women deacons and greater leadership roles began, but keep in mind that they were carefully managed. The next pope could either open those doors further or shut them completely. There's also the internal division between progressives and traditionalists. This might be the most dangerous challenge of all, because it's tearing the church from the inside. Some conservative Catholics have accused Francis of being too worldly, while progressives argue the church has barely changed. If the next pope leans too far in either direction, he risks splintering the unity of the global church. Also remember that the Catholic Church is growing fastest in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But these are also regions facing political instability, economic hardship, and in some cases, open persecution. How the Church protects and empowers these believers and whether it listens to their unique realities will also determine its global strength. Even though he's gone, Pope Francis isn't exactly leaving the room. His legacy is everywhere. He appointed the vast majority of cardinals who will vote for the next pope, which means, technically, they were chosen for aligning with his vision. That could favor a Francis-like successor, someone who values mercy over judgment, dialogue over dogma. But there's a twist. Some of those cardinals, while still outwardly loyal, may have actually grown disillusioned over time. The pace of change, the backlash, the controversies, and with Francis no longer watching, they may now vote differently than expected. Still, it's hard to ignore how deeply Francis reshaped the Church's public image. He was the Pope who was so humble, washed prisoners' feet, kissed the disabled, and openly said he refused to judge people. He met with refugees, condemned war profiteers, called out climate denial, and challenged economic inequality. He didn't just talk about Christ, he tried to live like Christ. Whether you loved or criticized him, Francis made Catholicism feel human again for many. So the next pope won't just be stepping into a leadership role, he'll be stepping into an expectation, one shaped by a man who refused the papal palace and chose instead a modest Vatican guest house. But can the Church stay unified? This is the question quietly keeping many Vatican officials up at night. Because the Church isn't just a spiritual body anymore. It's a global institution with billions of members. Francis tried to hold that body together with compassion and simplicity. But his death could trigger a slow unraveling unless the next pope finds a way to speak to all sides without losing his soul in the process. It's not just about dogma anymore. It's about whether the Church can offer a spiritual compass in a world full of chaos. Can it comfort the grieving, inspire the young, speak truth to power without becoming entangled in it? The conclave might choose someone safe, or bold, or surprisingly in between. But either way, the decision will define the Church's direction for decades. Francis began reforming the Vatican itself. He called for financial transparency, bureaucratic shakeups, and there was even talk of changing how synods work. The truth is, some of those reforms were left unfinished. The next pope must decide if he will continue the cleanup, or if he let it quietly fade into the background. So what happens next? That's the million-dollar question. The next few weeks, months, or maybe even years will decide whether the Church can emerge from this moment stronger or more divided than ever before. And the only thing we know for sure is the fact that the world is watching. But what do you think? Was Pope Francis's death just the end of a chapter or the beginning of a storm the Church isn't ready for? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss the next deep dive into news concerning the Vatican.